had to come back to the drawing board several times after being inspired to speak about this topic. And it wasn't until I finally changed the focus and the angle from the perpetrator and why they invoke these types of tactics to the types of people they catastrophically fail to trap. So it is my hope that by approaching it from this angle, it gives a bit of a roadmap or inspiration to people that are still in the trenches trying to find their way out. Every toxic system, every abusive group, or short sighted authority figure relies on a singular foundational weapon to maintain control, and that is the threat of exile. It is the oldest play in the human playbook. When an individual refuses to bend, when their natural traits disrupt the status quo, or when their glow makes the mediocre uncomfortable, the group deploys its ultimate psychological punishment: systemic isolation and abandonment. They lock the doors, they cut off communication, and they banish the individual to the psychological wilderness. This strategy is built on a specific, calculated expectation. If we make the wilderness cold enough, they will eventually crawl back, beg for re entry, and hand over their autonomy. Yet, all throughout human history, there's evidence littered with the wreckage of this exact strategy. In a staggering number of cases, this tactic doesn't just fail, it backfires catastrophically. Instead of breaking the target into a state of quiet subservience, the isolation acts as a forge. It strips away the noise, it removes the shackles of conformity, and it sharpens the individual's edge into a weapon that's capable of dismantling the very system that cast them out. This is the anatomy of systemic miscalculation. This is how the wilderness builds a free agent. To understand why this tactic backfires, we have to look at the psychological mechanics of the system itself. Coercive control and systemic bullying require a massive structural assumption. They assume that the victim values belonging to a herd more than they value their own skin, truth, sanity, or self respect. When a system decides to isolate an individual, it operates under three deeply flawed premises. One, the isolation will breed weakness. Two, that by stripping away the group's validation, this will in turn destroy the individual's authority. And three, that by casting the individual into the dark, this somehow eliminates their power. This group mistakes their own claustrophobic room for the entire world. They believe that by denying the individual a seat at their table, they are starving them. What they fail to realize is that the moment they lock this individual out, they accidentally release that person from the rules of the house. When you have nothing left to lose within a system, the system loses all leverage over you. The carrot is gone. which means that the stick no longer works. The environment strategy doesn't break the target, it forces a profound cognitive shift. The individual stops asking, how do I get back in? And they begin asking, why did I ever want to be in a room this small in the first place? When a system drops the guillotine of abandonment, it expects a broken spirit. Instead, depending on the psychological blueprint of the individual, it inadvertently triggers the evolution of three distinct and highly lethal archetypes. And these individuals don't just survive the wilderness, they weaponize it. The first type of individual that's likely to weaponize isolation and abandonment tactics is the alchemist. The system's first miscalculation is thinking that if they lock the alchemist out of the room, they will starve. For the alchemist, isolation never causes starvation. It provides an uninterrupted incubation, if you will. Because inside of the herd, a massive amount of cognitive and emotional energy is expended on masking. And masking is the constant exhausting process of dimming one's light or constantly monitoring your behavior or playing the political games required to keep insecure peers comfortable and happy. So when a system abruptly cuts the cord, they accidentally hand the alchemist the greatest luxury an alchemist's mind can have: silence. Without the static of the group's constant demands, the alchemist can turn completely inward. They take the very trait, the very skill, or the perspective that the group labeled as a defect, and they obsessively master it. The isolation for them becomes like a high pressure laboratory. This is where they can build hyper specialized expertise and refine their creative voice and even gain a terrifying level of sharp clarity when it comes to their personal vision. So the backfire is when the alchemist finally decides to step back into the light, they do not return as a compliant worker bee. They return as a master of a craft that the herd cannot replicate. The system attempted to freeze them out, but only succeeded in removing the distractions that were keeping them from becoming formidable in the first place. The second type of person that is liable to weaponize isolation and abandonment is what I like to call the sovereign disruptor. This is the person that is going to liberate themselves and other people from fear. This is anyone trying to use the system of the tactics of isolation and abandonment. This is the second miscalculation. It is by thinking that by stripping away their titles, by stripping away their approval, by stripping away their social standing, the individual will be rendered powerless. This is the ultimate blind spot. Systems, particularly the ultimate institutional blind spot, systems believe that power only flows from their hierarchy. Systems believe that power can only flow from their stamps of approval and their validation. When they completely withdraw these things from the sovereign disruptor, they accidentally grant them the ultimate psychological superpower. And that is immunity to the system's consequences. Fear of rejection is the invisible cage that keeps most people subservient. By enforcing the absolute worst case scenario, which is total abandonment, the system prematurely kills the target's fear. The sovereign disruptor looks around the wilderness, realizes they are still breathing, and then they experience a radical breakthrough. They realize that the system's authority was an illusion maintained only by their willingness to participate. So then the backfire is this: the sovereign disruptor develops a completely unshakable internal locus of control. They stop seeking a seat at the rig table and start building their own house. Because they no longer desires the group's applause, they cannot be bribed, they cannot be threatened, and they cannot be controlled. They return to the market or organization not to fit into the old machinery, but to introduce a new paradigm that renders the old machinery entirely obsolete. And the final third miscalculation, and the third type of individual that is likely to weaponize isolation and abandonment, is the misfit. The miscalculation is believing that the wilderness is empty and that by casting someone out, that means they will remain entirely alone. When a group banishes an individual, particularly a misfit, they view the wilderness for them as a graveyard. But the misfit does something peculiar. The misfit enters the dark, they look around, and they notice something the short-sighted herd completely missed. The wilderness is actually populated by the most brilliant, creative, and capable minds that the system was too insecure to hold. So instead of sitting in isolation, weeping over a herd that didn't want them, the misfit begins organizing the exiles. They recognize that the misfits possess an immense, unmapped collective leverage. And so they begin the business of building alternative networks, new platforms, families of their choosing, and disruptive businesses built on a foundation of mutual respect rather than transaction. So then the backfire for this individual becomes the system's cruelty. The system's cruelty accidentally creates the gravity that pulls its competitors together. By throwing away its best pieces, the system inadvertently supplies the raw materials for the misfit to build the rival ecosystem. Eventually, this new network will grow robust, flexible, and so culturally dominant that it outcompetes, out innovates, and ultimately swallows the original group whole. The ultimate tragedy of the isolation and abandonment tactics is that the system, whether that is an organization, whether that is a family, whether that is a friend group, they almost always realize their mistakes too late. There usually comes a moment of crisis, a shift in the market, a sudden fog, or a change in cultural landscape where the old, stagnant, conforming herd realizes that it lacks the vision, it lacks the drive, and it lacks the unique capability required to survive. They look around and they realize that by forcing everyone to think, act, and look exactly the same, they have bred a culture of uniform incompetence. They look out into the wilderness and see the very person they discarded, glowing with an unmistakable self generated brilliance. But the system's final desperate insult is in assuming the system's final unmitigated gall attempt is in assuming that the individual will be grateful for the sudden invitation to be accepted again. They expect the individual to view this crisis, view this change in cultural landscape as an opportunity to finally earn the validation they were denied years ago. And this is where the backfire reaches its absolute completion. Because the thriver, the one who escaped, survived, and thrived, whether they are the alchemist or the sovereign disruptor or the misfit, they look back at the closed room that brought them so much anguish. They are able to see it clearly. They don't see it as a fortress of elite belonging, but as a small, fragile box built on fear and conditional tolerance. In closing, I like to say that the wilderness is not where you go to die. It is where the noise dies. Isolation is a terrifying tactic only as long as you are trying to get back inside of the house. The moment you turn your back on the door and face the open horizon, the system's power evaporates and your training begins. They didn't isolate you to break you. They isolated you because they couldn't control you. And in doing so, they accidentally set you free. Collective, I love you so, so much.